Following the apocalypse, a father and his two sons struggle for survival against nocturnal beasts. In an alternate Earth, Paul rushes out of a garage with a heavy backpack. As he runs through a narrow alley, he hears sirens and loud explosions as people try to fight off the mysterious creatures invading the country. After escaping the city, he goes to his hiding spot in the woods. There, he carries his twin infant sons, assuring them that everything's okay. 15 years later, Paul and his teenage sons live in a remote farmhouse, where they protect themselves from the monsters that only come out at night. One day, the worried father looks in the distance waiting for his other son. Coming from a nearby farm, Thomas runs fast and jumps over a crevice so he can arrive home safely before the sun sets. Meanwhile, Paul's other son, the analytical Joseph, looks at the lines and shadows on the wall, checking his twin's distance. When Joseph alerts him, Paul runs forward to meet Thomas, scolding him for being late. The impulsive teenager then apologizes, reasoning that he lost track of time. As his dad and brother return to the house, Joseph looks at them with a worried expression. Following this, he shuts the window and places the lamp near the stairs. Once Paul and Thomas are inside the house, they all work together to make sure the doors are all impenetrable to protect themselves from the nocturnal creatures. Afterward, the family heads to the dining area for dinner. Thomas then prays before eating, thanking God for the nourishment they will receive and for bringing them all together. Following this, Paul scolds his son once more for being late, reminding him that he can't go past the boundaries if he doesn't arrive home on time. In his defense, the teenager mentions that he was just helping Mr. Rose, a farmer. However, his dad sees through him and knows what he's really doing there. Joseph then interjects, asking his brother about what's special about the farm he's visiting. Thomas sarcastically answers, reasoning that it's because his brother isn't there. However, this exchange only leads to a physical altercation. Paul immediately breaks up the fight, reprimanding his sons for acting like animals. Later, while Thomas reads a book, he notices that Joseph is playing chess by himself to recreate a game from 1961. The teenager then joins his brother, and their dad watches them. Suddenly, they're interrupted when their dog, Rocco, starts digging on the wooden floor. This immediately alerts the family. Paul grabs a weapon while Thomas takes the lamp and heads downstairs. After the teenager places the lamp near the door, he hears a loud bang due to the monster's attempt to enter. Paul joins his son, and together, they hold the door until the creatures give up. Meanwhile, Joseph remains upstairs, silently making calculations. Once Paul and Thomas are on the second floor, the intellectual teenager reports his observations to them, revealing that the monster shook the door thrice. He details that the first attempt took 10 seconds, the second was 20 seconds, and the last was 1 second. Hearing this, Thomas doesn't get the point of his brother's calculations. Joseph then explains his theories. The first attempt must be the monster's test. The second was an actual attempt to break through the door, and the third was frustration. The next morning, Paul checks the door, finding claw scratches and blood. Upon removing the wood, he's startled to find bugs under it. Later, he asks assistance from his twins to pull a branch off a fallen tree. Immediately after the task's completion, Thomas excitedly heads to Mr. Rose's farm. That afternoon in the garage, Joseph sketches a cage trap in his notebook. Suddenly, Paul interrupts, asking what he's been working on. The teenager then reveals the makeshift vehicle he created, which he can't get to start. He explains that he built it because he doesn't want to hide from the creatures anymore. Paul then reads an article out loud, which says that the monsters were believed to have arrived after people caused pollution and that their goal is to eliminate all humans to cleanse the planet. He then admits he disagrees with the idea, thinking that the past Earth was the worst and now the air and water are getting cleaner. He also believes that other people out there may soon rescue them. Afterward, Paul swaps the relays in his son's vehicle, finally getting it to start. He teaches Joseph to drive it the next morning. During the lesson, the teenager struggles to drive smoothly, prompting his brother to joke that he doesn't feel safe as his passenger. When they're done, Thomas excitedly excuses himself so he can go to Mr. Rose's farm again. However, Paul stops his son from leaving. He instructs him to accompany Joseph to the river so they can get some equipment that can help with reinforcing their window covers. During the ride, Thomas complains, emphasizing that their dad requested it because Joseph is poorly skilled in driving alone. Hearing this, the annoyed teenager asserts that he doesn't need his brother's help. Thomas then takes advantage and gets out of the vehicle. He then orders his sibling to meet with him later behind the hill so they can go home together. Arriving at the farm, the teenager meets Mr. Rose and Mrs. Rose, informing them that he has returned to finish his incompleted tasks. However, he ends up spending time with his crush, Charlotte, the couple's beautiful daughter. After reinforcing the door, Paul unwinds and smokes by the waterfalls. Suddenly, he's interrupted when he notices a strange hole in the rocks. Meanwhile, Joseph enters an abandoned place to get equipment, only to discover that it's infested with bugs. Charlotte brings Thomas to the tree where her parents used to take her as a kid. There, she invites him to play Crappy Apocalypse, where players must tell a story about what happened at the end of the world in 10 seconds. Charlotte then goes first. She narrates that the apocalypse was caused by an infected bug that bit a lot of people, leaving few survivors. During Thomas's turn, he shares that a purple haze covered the entire sky, and when people breathed it in, they transformed into wolves. Charlotte then chuckles at the story, but Thomas notices that it's getting late, so he tells her that he has to go home. Before he leaves, Charlotte asks if he has a few moments to spare. Thomas nods and she hugs him tightly for 10 seconds. After fleeing the bug-infested place, Joseph returns to his vehicle only to realize that it won't start. Realizing that the sun will go down anytime soon, he tries to fix it as fast as he can. At the farmhouse, Paul worries when he realizes that his twins aren't home yet. Joseph finally gets the car to start and rushes to drive while Thomas trips and falls into an underground cave. When his brother doesn't show up at the meeting place, Joseph decides to leave, thinking that Thomas went home without him. However, when he arrives at the farmhouse, he realizes that his brother is missing. Paul then instructs Joseph to secure the house for the night while he searches for Thomas in the woods with Rocco. Before leaving, the worried father heads to the greenhouse to get a sharp weapon. Meanwhile, Thomas gains consciousness but is unable to see anything clearly. He walks forward and snaps a twig. Then, he looks upward and realizes how far he is from the opening. As the sun goes down, Paul ventures into the woods while carrying a torch, hoping to find his son. Underground, Thomas uses his lighter to see his path, only to encounter a monster. Meanwhile, after locking all the doors, Joseph hears the wood creaking, indicating that a creature is attempting to enter. Underground, Thomas utilizes a sharp tool to break free from the beast that's holding his leg. When he uses his lighter to irritate it, the monster only grabs his face. Hearing the loud screech, Paul finds the creature and pulls it out from the cave, saving his son from danger. When they reunite, they hug each other tightly. Thomas then explains how he fell into the cave and hit his head. Hearing this, the worried dad thinks that he has a concussion and suggests they stay there until dawn. They then work together to close up the entrance. While Joseph's sleeping in a chair, a monster removes the piece of wood from the door, extending its claws through the hole toward the unsuspecting teenager. Unable to reach him, the beast pulls its arm back to open the door from the inside. As the creature approaches, Joseph opens his eyes and pulls the string beside him. A cage then falls from above, trapping the monster. As Paul hears the monsters near the entrance, he directs his son to pull the rock while he prepares himself to confront them. However, to their surprise, the creatures begin to emerge from underneath instead. When they attempt to escape, Thomas realizes that they have no way out. Quick on his feet, Paul takes an explosive from his bag and asks his son to stay back. Then, he places it on the rocks and it blows up. That morning, Joseph worries because his dad and twin aren't home yet. He then drives to the woods to search for them. After the explosion, Thomas pulls his unconscious father out of the cave. Soon, his brother finds them through Rocco's guidance. Thomas then details everything that happened, starting from how he fell into the cave to how their dad blew up his arm during their fight with the creatures. The twins then carry the unconscious Paul to the vehicle and lay him on the couch upon arriving home. When they're in the bedroom, Thomas discovers that Joseph has captured a monster and kept it trapped inside a covered cage. When the impulsive teenager attempts to remove the cover, his twin stops him, stating that the light will hurt the creature. While Thomas tends to their father's hand, Joseph shares his discovery from the previous night's capture. The intelligent teenager mentions the monster's 8-minute attempt to enter the house, the presence of 2 creatures initially, and his capture of 1. However, he senses something off about them. Upon hearing this, Thomas shares his experience, revealing how he and his dad managed to defeat a group of creatures the previous night. He then volunteers to eliminate his brother's catch. When they accidentally open the cage, the creature hides under the bed. Joseph then gets a stick just in case it attacks them. Soon, the monster emerges and appears in the corner of the room, prompting Rocco to bark and approach it. Thomas immediately stops his dog, but the beast turns its attention toward him. Just in time, Joseph steps on the monster's body and pierces it with a sharp stick. Afterward, Thomas beheads it using an axe. Then, the intelligent teenager takes the creature's body to the garage where he slices it open to study its organs. Suddenly, Thomas interrupts him, suggesting they take their dad to Mr. Rose's farm because they offer better medicine and care there. However, Joseph dismisses the idea, believing it's a waste of time and they won't receive assistance. Despite his brother's objections, Thomas strictly insists they should go. They then carry Paul into the car and drive to the farm. Upon meeting Mr. and Mrs. Rose at the entrance, Thomas explains everything that happened and requests medical care and accommodation. However, Mrs. Rose apologizes, explaining they have no medicine to spare and can't accommodate someone with such severe injuries. Mr. Rose then expresses confidence that Paul, being a strong man, will pull through. Hearing this, a confused Charlotte interjects, correcting that they do have room. However, Mrs. Rose reiterates that only Thomas can stay, emphasizing that this will ensure there are enough supplies left at their farmhouse for Paul's care. Hearing this, Joseph urges his brother to stay since he wants that anyway. He then expresses his frustration, stating he doesn't want anything from Thomas as he perceives him to avoid responsibility and act impulsively, ultimately blaming him for their father's condition. Triggered, Thomas pushes his twin to the ground and begins to strangle him, only to stop shortly after. Disappointed, Joseph quickly rises and drives off, leaving his brother behind. Once inside the house, Charlotte encourages Thomas to eat to keep his strength up. Afterward, he brings him to his quarters. Thomas becomes curious about the rocking horse, which Charlotte confirms is a toy. Upon hearing this, the teenager explains that at the farmhouse, they only have sticks and bugs to play with. Further in their conversation, Charlotte asks him if he's nervous, to which he replies that he's not, expressing that she's the only thing in the world that makes him happy. Following this, they share a kiss, but their moment is suddenly interrupted by Mr. Rose, who strictly instructs his daughter to leave the room. While driving, Joseph passes the forest and notices the sheep running in different directions, indicating that something bad is going to happen. Upon arriving home, the teenager quickly brings his dad inside the farmhouse. After discovering the monster's footsteps in the garage, he thoroughly examines all the floors, realizing that it's the creature's new entry point. Later, Charlotte catches Thomas searching for something on the cupboard, prompting him to admit that he won't be able to stay. When he begs for medicine, she takes a bottle from a container and gives it to him. He then hugs her and promises to return. As Thomas flees, one of Mr. Rose's farmers, Hobson, who overheard the teen's conversation, catches him. He threatens him with his rifle and accuses him of stealing, despite his defense that Charlotte gave it to him. Thomas explains that he was running so he could arrive home before sunset. Still, the farmer orders him not to leave. After securing the windows that night, Joseph walks across the carpet but suddenly discovers a hole underneath, indicating that a creature has emerged from it. Meanwhile, the farmers bring Thomas inside their dorm and tie him to the bed. As Hobson prepares to shoot him, the ground suddenly opens up, causing him to fall. Not long after, a beast comes out of the hole. The noise awakens Mr. Rose. He takes his candle and gazes out the window, feeling compelled to check outside. However, as he's about to leave, a monster attacks him, causing him to drop the candle. Though Mrs. Rose escapes, a creature meets her on the way and ends her life. A worried Charlotte then leaves her room, only to see a monster in the bathroom. Meanwhile, the beasts begin pulling the farmers underground while Thomas remains tied up. Some manage to escape the dorm, only to encounter more monsters outside. Just as Thomas breaks free, a beast appears in front of him, but Charlotte arrives to shoot it, saving his life. Afterward, the duo flees the burning area and heads to the farmhouse. Meanwhile, Joseph blocks the floor hole with furniture. Soon, Thomas and Charlotte arrive. After handing the medicine, the teenager apologizes to his brother, admitting he can't do anything on his own. Just then, Paul regains consciousness and takes his medicine. Joseph then informs his dad that the creatures dug under the house and will soon emerge through the floors. When the teenager asks his father about their next step, Paul urges them to fight off the creatures. Taking the advice, Joseph devises a plan, and with the help of his twin and Charlotte, they transport the petrol and freezer from the shed to the farmhouse. Next, the trio works together to protect themselves from the anticipated monster attack. Joseph arranges the furniture in one place, pours petrol on them, and creates a makeshift dynamite. Meanwhile, Thomas and Charlotte block the entrance with wood to keep the beasts out. Just then, the duo hears noise underground, prompting them to prepare their weapons. Unbeknownst to them, one monster has already entered the house through the fireplace. Suddenly, two creatures emerge from the underground hole and attack Thomas and Charlotte, but they manage to defeat them with their weapons. Following this, the duo rushes upstairs to join Joseph. As Thomas helps his brother carry the freezer to the other room, Paul suddenly awakens. He then takes the rifle from Charlotte and shoots the floor. When Joseph notices this, he stops his dad, informing him that he set a trap. Despite this, Paul faces the monsters with his bat, and soon, the trio helps him in defeating the rest. Afterward, the teenagers hurry to the other room, but Paul locks them there so he can sacrifice himself. The trio hides in the freezer without him. The dynamite then explodes, burning everything down. Following this, the twins search for their dad in the ruins, but when they hear a growl, they rush to the vehicle. A fiery rolling beast tries to chase them but ultimately succumbs to the fire. The next morning, Thomas notices Joseph looking sad because of their nearly broken vehicle. He offers to help him rebuild it, but his twin declines because he wants to create something else instead. Following this, the trio places 3 crosses near Charlotte's tree to pay their respects to their deceased family members. Joseph hands the car keys to his twin, impressed by his driving skills. When Thomas asks about their next destination, his brother plans to visit the other 6 farms in the valley. When Charlotte asks if the creatures got to the others, Joseph expresses hope that somebody survived because they did. Following this, the trio gets into the car and drives off.